The sea is quiet tonight. Its surface stretches into the distance like a sheet of deep blue silk, undisturbed and endless, reflecting the final light of the sun as it sinks gently toward the horizon. The sky slowly shifts from warm gold to soft violet, and the first faint stars begin to appear. A calm, cool breeze moves across the water, carrying with it the scent of salt and distant shores. For a long moment, the world seems perfectly still. It is in moments like this, quiet evenings near the sea, that ancient stories often begin. Long before maps were drawn, long before compasses guided travelers, there were tales told by sailors, priests, poets, and wanderers. Some spoke of storms, others spoke of distant islands, and a few, whispered carefully in the glow of oil lamps, spoke of something more mysterious, something much older, much grander, and almost forgotten. They spoke of Atlantis, not as a fantasy, not as a dream, but as a memory, faint like the outline of a distant island hidden behind mist. Tonight, we return to that memory. As the sun finally slips beneath the horizon, the deep blue of dusk settles over the water. Waves move slowly, as though the sea itself is breathing. The air becomes cooler, softer, inviting your mind into a calm state, into a space where ancient tales rise gently like the tide. For thousands of years, the story of Atlantis has drifted through human history. It appears only briefly in the ancient world, mentioned in two dialogues written by the philosopher Plato, the Timaeus and the Critias. These texts are not heroic epics or long sagas. They are quiet conversations, philosophical in nature, recorded as though someone were remembering a much older story passed from one generation to the next. Plato himself never claimed the story was his. He said it came from an ancestor, Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, who heard it during his travels in Egypt. Solon, known for his wisdom, visited the ancient temple city of Sais, where priests preserved records far older than anything held in Greece. In those quiet chambers lit by flickering lamps, the Egyptian priest told Solon of a great island civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time, a land of wealth, order, beauty, and power, fallen, swallowed by the sea in a single night and day of misfortune. But before the fall, before the storms, before the earth shook, Atlantis was peaceful, prosperous, green, warm, alive with the rhythm of sea and stone. It existed in a time when the world was different, when cities were fewer, and nature shaped the patterns of life more strongly than kings or armies. Some say Atlantis lay beyond the pillars of Heracles, far out in the vast Atlantic waters. Others imagine it closer, near ancient coasts long altered by time. But wherever its shores might have been, the story begins not with destruction, but with quiet beauty, just like the sea before you now. As night deepens, the water turns darker, almost mirror-like. The stars above glow more brightly, scattered across the sky like small fires of ancient memory. The world begins to sink into stillness, and it is in this stillness that we begin our journey. Not to discover what is true or false, not to chase lost continents or forgotten maps, but simply to follow the story as it was once passed down, softly, calmly, patiently, from philosopher to student, to traveler, to listener. For stories like this are meant not to excite the heart, but to soothe the mind, to slow thoughts, to connect us to times long past, where the world moved gently and the boundaries between memory and myth were soft as the night breeze. The tale of Atlantis begins not with thunder, but with quiet water, with the sea breathing slowly under the first stars of evening. with the distant echo of ancient voices carried across generations. And tonight, those voices rise again, soft, steady, and calm, asking you to drift with them into the story of a world long forgotten, yet never fully lost. A world born from the sea, a world shaped by harmony, a world remembered in whispers, a world called Atlantis. The story of Atlantis, as Plato tells it, does not begin in Greece at all. It begins far from the Aegean Sea, in the ancient land of Egypt. The journey that carried this memory forward started with Solon, one of the wisest men of Athens. He was a statesman, a poet, and a traveller, a man who sought not only laws and justice, but also knowledge from distant cultures. During his later years, Solon travelled to Egypt, a land whose temples were already old when Greece was still young. Egypt was a place where time moved differently, slow, steady, shaped by the rhythm of the Nile. Its priests guarded ancient records carved into stone, recorded long before the earliest myths of Greece had taken shape. Solon arrived in the city of Sais, an ancient centre of wisdom. The buildings there were tall and pale, made of limestone that glowed softly under the sun. Columns rose in rows, decorated with painted symbols. Cool hallways led into sacred chambers where the air smelled of stone, cedar resin, and faint traces of incense. Inside one of these temples, Solon met a group of elderly priests who preserved the oldest stories of their civilization, stories far older than any Greek tale. They welcomed him with calm respect, not with excitement, not with ceremony, just quiet recognition, as though they had been expecting a seeker of wisdom. Solon began to speak of Greek history and its heroic age, the era of Theseus and the ancient battles. He described the stories proudly, as any Greek would. But when he finished, one of the priests smiled gently, the way one smiles at a child who speaks earnestly, yet does not understand the vastness of the world. The priest told him something surprising. Solon, Solon, you Greeks are children. You are all young in your minds, for you remember only one flood, one fire, one fall of cities. But many have happened, and your people have forgotten them all. The temple chamber was quiet. Dust floated softly in the warm light. Solon listened. The priest continued slowly, as though reciting a memory long held and rarely spoken aloud. There was once a great island kingdom, he said. It lay beyond the pillars of Heracles, a land larger than Libya and Asia together, a powerful kingdom blessed by the gods. Solon leaned forward. His interest deepened. The priest went on. Your ancestors defeated this kingdom when it tried to conquer the Mediterranean. But after its pride grew too great, the gods withdrew their favor. In a single day and night of misfortune, the island sank beneath the sea. These were the first words Solon ever heard about Atlantis. The story did not come from sailors' rumors or wandering storytellers. It came from a sacred hall, spoken calmly by a priest whose order had kept written records for thousands of years. The temple walls around them were covered in painted scenes, stars, rivers, gods guiding the world with open palms. Solon looked at them, wondering how many cycles of rise and fall these stones had witnessed. The priest explained that civilizations rise like the sun and fall like the moon, not once, not twice, but many times across the ages. Some are destroyed by flood, others by fire, others by the slow shifting of the earth. But a few leave behind memories preserved in stone. Atlantis, he said, was one of these memories. It was not a fantasy or a legend. It was part of an older history, one Greece had forgotten. Solon was deeply moved. He asked the priest to share everything he knew. The priest agreed, pleased to see a Greek who who wished to learn rather than boast. In the silent temple, under the soft glow of oil lamps, Solon listened to the story of a lost world, a kingdom blessed by Poseidon, a people of great skill and harmony, a city built in shining circles of land and water, a powerful fleet that crossed the seas, and a fall that came not from nature alone, but from the turning of the human heart. When the conversation ended, the priest placed his hand gently on Solon's shoulder. "Write this story," he said, "so your people may remember again." Solon promised he would. He returned to Greece with this ancient tale, intending to share it with all, but he never found the time to record it fully. The task passed instead to his descendant Critias, and from him to Plato. The tale survived not as a grand epic, but as a quiet memory carried across generations, through the temples of Egypt, through the family of Solon, and finally into the writings of a philosopher. And so, through a simple conversation in a calm, dimly lit chamber, the memory of Atlantis began its journey into the world once more. As the night deepens and the sea outside grows darker, imagine Solon stepping out of the temple at sunset, the sky painted in red and gold, the Nile moving slowly through the desert, and in his hands the fragile beginning of a story that would echo across millennia, a story he carried home like a lantern in the dusk. Before the story of Atlantis begins, the Egyptian priests told Solon something deeper, something about the nature of time itself. According to their oldest records, the world had passed through many ages, each ending and beginning again, like the slow turning of the stars. "The world forgets," the priest said gently, "but the earth remembers." He explained that humanity had lived through countless cycles. Some ages were long and peaceful. Others ended suddenly, washed away by floods, shaken by earthquakes, or slowly erased by changes in climate. After each destruction, most knowledge vanished, and people were forced to begin again. Egypt, he said, was an exception. Its dry climate and stone temples preserved memories that would have disappeared elsewhere. Floods destroyed Greek cities. Fires consumed wooden houses. But in Egypt, the past survived in carved walls and hidden chambers. Solon listened quietly as the priest described a world older than Greece and older than Egypt. A world before the last great flood. It was a time when the climate was softer, the seas calmer, and the land richer. Forests grew thick. Rivers flowed where deserts stand today. The people lived in harmony with nature, guided more by the rhythm of the earth than by kings. Some regions flourished more than others. One of these, the priest said, was an island kingdom far beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a place blessed with fertile soil, warm springs, and great natural abundance. A place whose people built beautiful cities, crafted fine works of stone and metal, and sailed across wide seas. This was Atlantis. The priest spoke slowly, as though reciting a memory preserved across generations. He explained that before the flood, several advanced societies existed, but after the destruction, only fragments remained. Names, symbols, traces of knowledge. Most of the world had been forced back into simplicity. Solon felt a quiet awe grow within him. The idea that civilizations rose and fell long before the familiar histories of Greece made his own era feel like part of a much larger story. The priest continued, "Your people remember only the last destruction, but many came before. Each time, only a few survived, carrying fragments of memory into the next age. In Egypt, we preserved what we could." He explained that the priests had records carved into stone that described the early world, the changes of the earth, and the rise and fall of nations long forgotten. Among these memories was the account of Atlantis, a powerful island kingdom that lived in a time of harmony, grew into a force that stretched across the seas, and eventually fell when its people turned away from balance. In the quiet temple hall, lit by faint oil lamps, Solon imagined these earlier ages, green valleys now lost beneath deserts, rivers whose courses had changed, coastlines swallowed by water. He imagined people who lived peacefully, guided by simple rituals, building slowly toward beauty and understanding. The priest explained that Atlantis existed in one of these older ages. Its people lived close to nature, shaped by the generosity of their land. They built terraces, temples, harbors, and canals. They honored the sea and used its resources wisely. Their society grew strong, perhaps too strong. But when pride grows, the priest said softly, even the greatest cities can fall. Still, he did not describe the fall yet. That part would come later. For now, he wished Solon to understand only one thing. Atlantis belonged to a world before the world he knew. A world erased not by legend, but by the slow turning of the earth itself. Solon felt himself standing at the edge of a deep past, listening not to a story invented, but to a memory preserved across centuries. A memory of an age washed away, leaving behind only the faintest trace, like the soft outline of an island hidden by mist. The priest rested his hands on the stone table between them. If you understand the world before the flood, he said kindly, you will understand Atlantis. Solon nodded, absorbing every word. Outside, the desert wind moved softly. Inside the temple, time seemed to pause. Through the stillness, Solon felt the story of Atlantis beginning to take shape, not as myth, but as a distant memory carried across ages, waiting to be told once more. When the Egyptian priest finally began describing Atlantis itself, Solon listened with complete attention. The temple around them was quiet, lit by a few gentle lamps, and the priest spoke slowly, as if reciting a memory preserved for many generations. He began with the land. Atlantis, he said, was a large island lying beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the wide ocean that stretched far beyond the known world. Many small islands surrounded it, but Atlantis was the greatest of them all. Its soil was rich, its climate soft, and its natural features abundant. The landscape was peaceful and harmonious. Forests grew on the hills, fields covered the plains, and warm springs flowed from the earth. Mountains rose in the distance, catching the early light of day. The central plain of the island was broad and fertile, perfect for farming and for raising animals. In the middle of this plain stood a low hill, and on that hill, the Atlanteans built their sacred city. The city's design was unique. 3 rings of land and 2 rings of water arranged in perfect circles. Bridges crossed the watery rings, and wide canals allowed ships to move easily through the city. From above, the pattern would have looked like ripples formed by a single drop falling into calm water. Solon imagined boats gliding through these circular channels, the reflections of stone and sky shimmering softly in the water. At the very center of the city rose the sacred hill crowned with a great temple dedicated to Poseidon. The priest described it as a large, radiant structure made of stones that shone in red, black, and white. Its walls were decorated with precious metals, and statues stood tall within the temple, crafted with extraordinary skill. The most impressive statue depicted Poseidon riding a chariot drawn by winged horses. It was said to have been covered in shining metal that reflected the sun, making the temple glow from a great distance. Yet despite its splendor, the spiritual life of Atlantis was quiet and respectful. The Atlanteans offered simple gifts, flowers, fruits, and clear water. Their rituals were calm, their worship sincere. Daily life in Atlantis was gentle and steady. Homes were built from beautiful stones of different colors, polished to a smooth shine. Gardens bloomed with fruit trees and vines. Water flowed through carefully built channels, cooling the courtyards. The air smelled of the sea and fresh earth. Farmers tended large fields, shepherds guided their flocks across green pastures, and artisans created pottery, ornaments and tools. The island's natural abundance meant that people rarely wanted for anything. Ships filled the harbors, carrying goods to nearby islands and distant lands. Beyond the city, the island remained peaceful and varied. There were hot springs whose waters Atlanteans believed were healing. There were long meadows where horses ran freely. There were mountains rich with metals, forests dense with timber, and fields that produced generous harvests. Everything on the island seemed balanced. Nature, society, and daily life all supporting one another. The priest emphasized that Atlantis was not simply powerful. It was orderly. It was fair. It was guided by the principle of harmony. Its rulers, believed to be descendants of Poseidon, governed with moderation. 10 kings shared responsibility for the island, each ruling a district but bound together by common laws. They met regularly in the central temple to discuss matters of justice and to maintain peace among the people. In its early days, Atlantis was not a nation seeking to conquer others. It was a place of cooperation and understanding. Solon listened, picturing the circular city glowing softly in the morning light, its buildings reflecting warm colors, the canals moving like ribbons of silver through the land. He imagined gentle breezes passing through orchards, the calm movement of ships in the harbor, and the quiet dignity of a people living close to nature. The priest allowed a moment of silence for Solon to absorb the vision. Atlantis, he said softly, was a world shaped by harmony. Solon felt the image settle in his mind like a peaceful dream. An island of shining circles, fertile plains, warm springs, and a people who lived with grace and balance. A world as calm as the sea at dusk. As the priest continued his account, he shifted from the land of Atlantis to the people who lived upon it. His voice remained calm and steady, as though speaking not of legends, but of a civilization whose memory lingered softly in the ancient stones of the temple. The people of Atlantis, he said, lived with dignity. They were known for their moderation, their sense of fairness, and their peaceful rhythm of life. Their society was built on cooperation rather than conflict, and their daily routines followed the natural order of the island, its tides, its seasons, its gentle climate. At the center of their society were the 10 kings, descendants of Poseidon. They did not rule with heavy hands. Instead, they governed through a shared council, meeting regularly at the great temple atop the sacred hill. There, under the soft light of dawn or dusk, they discussed matters of justice, trade, and the well-being of the island. Their laws were carved on a pillar of shining metal, placed within the temple for all to see. These laws emphasized truthfulness, restraint, and respect. The kings were expected to follow them just as strictly as the common people. Because the land was generous, the Atlanteans had no need to struggle for survival. Food was plentiful, metal was abundant, forests provided timber, and the sea provided fish. Craftsmen used the island's resources to create tools and objects of great beauty. In the city, peaceful work filled each day. Potters shaped clay at slow, steady wheels. Carpenters carved wood with graceful precision. Metalworkers smelted bronze and other alloys, their furnaces glowing warmly long into the evening. Weavers produced colorful fabrics that moved softly in the sea breeze. Farmers tended wheat, barley, fruits, and vegetables. Shepherds guided flocks across the wide green plains. Fishermen glided along the calm waters of the circular harbor, casting nets with practiced ease. Nothing in their work was rushed. Nothing was frantic. Each task was part of a gentle rhythm that shaped life on the island. The priest described the Atlanteans as people who valued balance above all else. They understood the natural world deeply, its tides, its winds, its quiet moods. They built their homes to welcome the flow of air and light. They planted trees near their houses for shade and comfort. They designed their fields to follow the curves of the land. Families lived close together, often with gardens surrounding their homes. Children ran through courtyards filled with fruit trees, their laughter carried by the soft sea breeze. Elders sat under the shade of vines, sharing stories from earlier generations. There was little need for walls or guards within the city. Trust and cooperation guided daily life. Disputes were rare, and when they did occur, they were resolved by the Council of Kings with calm discussion, rather than punishment. The priest paused, letting the atmosphere of Atlantis settle in Solon's mind. Then he added, "The people of Atlantis were strong not because of their weapons, but because of their virtue. They valued wisdom. They valued restraint. They valued community more than personal ambition. In the evenings, families often gathered near the water's edge. Lamps burned softly. Music drifted through the air. Simple melodies played on stringed instruments or pipes. The sea reflected the warm glow of the city's stones as the moon rose slowly above the hills. Solon imagined these scenes clearly. Fathers mending nets, mothers preparing evening meals, artisans polishing their tools as the day cooled, children tracing circles in the sand, imitating the shape of their city, priests walking quietly toward the temple to offer thanks at dusk. The priest of sires explained that the Atlanteans lived close to the gods not through grand displays, but through quiet reverence. Their rituals were simple: gifts of flowers, fruit, clear water. They did not believe the divine required extravagance. Instead, they believed harmony itself was a form of worship. For many generations, this balance held. The kings remained fair. The people remained content. The island remained peaceful and prosperous. Solon listened in silence, understanding that the greatness of Atlantis did not lie only in its wealth or its structures, but in the character of its people. They lived with a kind of calm strength, firm yet gentle, ambitious yet restrained. And it was this harmony that allowed them to build a society admired even across oceans. As the priest finished describing these early generations, the temple chamber grew quiet again. The soft flicker of the lamps created gentle shadows across the walls. Solon felt as though he could almost hear the distant sound of waves brushing the circular harbors of Atlantis. He sensed that this calm, balanced world, though long vanished, was still alive in the memory of those who cherished its story. A world shaped not by might, but by the quiet dignity of its people. As the priest continued his calm retelling, Solon began to understand how Atlantis rose from a peaceful island to a respected power of the ancient world. The transition was slow and natural, like the steady widening of a river as it moves toward the sea. Nothing about their rise was rushed or forceful. It unfolded gently, shaped by the generosity of the land and the steady hands of its people. Atlantis grew strong, the priest said, as a tree grows tall, quietly, patiently, rooted in harmony. The island itself was the first source of its strength. Its vast plain produced rich harvests year after year. Fruit trees thrived in the warm climate. Forests covered the hills, offering timber for construction and fuel. Mountains provided copper, tin, silver, and other minerals. Rivers and springs flowed with clear water, some warm and filled with natural minerals. With such abundance, the Atlanteans were able to develop skills in every craft. Farmers became experts in irrigation and planting. Carpenters built strong ships and beautifully crafted homes. Stonemasons shaped blocks of red, white, and black stone with remarkable precision. Metalworkers melted and blended ores into tools, ornaments, and trade goods. As their craftsmanship improved, so did their reputation among neighboring lands. Their pottery was smooth and balanced. Their metal blades were sharp and durable. Their woven fabrics were bright and carefully dyed. Other regions welcomed Atlantean goods, and so the island ships set sail. Solon pictured their harbors, rows of vessels tied to wooden posts, sailors preparing ropes, merchants carrying jars of oil, grain, and precious metals, and peaceful conversations drifting across the water. The priest explained that Atlantean sailors were skilled navigators. They studied the stars, the direction of winds, and the behavior of waves. They discovered safe routes to distant islands and coastlines. They learned the customs of other peoples and brought home new knowledge. Atlantis grew wiser with each journey, but even as trade increased, daily life on the island remained calm. Fishermen still cast nets at dawn. Farmers still tended fields in the soft morning light. Artisans still shaped clay and stone with patient hands. Families still gathered at dusk to enjoy simple meals beside gardens filled with fruit trees. The Council of 10 Kings oversaw everything with fairness. They met regularly in the sacred temple, discussing any issues that arose. They maintained canals, improved harbors, and ensured that laws were followed gently but firmly. Their leadership allowed the island to flourish without chaos or rivalry. Over time, Atlantis' influence expanded. Their ships traveled to Libya, Egypt, and far across the Mediterranean. They traded with island communities and mainland cultures. They offered safe harbors and brought valuable goods. Everywhere they went, they were respected for their order and craftsmanship. Atlantis did not seek power, the priest said softly. Power came to it because of harmony. For a long time, the island's rise was peaceful. There were no great wars, no harsh demands on other nations. Atlantis became known as a center of prosperity, knowledge, and calm strength. Yet prosperity can carry a quiet burden. When abundance is great, the priest continued, the heart must remain humble. Otherwise, even gentle nations may drift from their path. He explained that small changes began to appear in the generations that followed. Not dramatic changes, just subtle ones. A little more pride, a little more desire for influence, a slight shift in focus from harmony to ambition. But these early signs were faint, barely noticeable. The island remained peaceful, prosperous, and respected. Still, the priest wanted Solon to understand that the rise of Atlantis contained the seeds of both its greatness and its future trial. For now, he spoke only of the height of its power, the era when ships filled the harbors, craftsmen produced remarkable works, the Council of Kings ruled with fairness, temples glowed in the morning light, and people lived in comfort without fear or struggle. Atlantis, at this time, was admired across the known world. As the priest paused, the lamps in the temple flickered softly. Solon imagined a gentle breeze passing through the circular canals of Atlantis, carrying the sounds of work, laughter, and distant music. A civilization at peace with itself, standing quietly at the peak of its strength. And yet, In the softness of that image, Solon sensed what the priest wished him to notice, that all great rises carry the first shadows of change. For many generations, Atlantis lived in harmony. Its people worked calmly, its rulers governed wisely, and the land produced everything needed for a peaceful life. The island stood as a symbol of balance and gentle prosperity. But as the priest continued his story, his voice took on a reflective tone, soft and thoughtful. "No greatness remains unchanged," he said. "Not because the gods punish, but because the human heart slowly shifts." The change in Atlantis began quietly. There were no wars, no disasters, no sudden upheavals. Only small differences, almost invisible at first. New generations grew up in comfort, surrounded by abundance they did not have to earn. They knew only full fields, thriving trade and calm seas. This softened their character, not in dramatic ways, but subtly. They were still good people, the priest said, but they no longer guarded the virtues that shaped their ancestors. Where earlier generations valued moderation, the newer ones were drawn to comfort. Where rulers once acted with restraint, later ones felt a growing desire for influence. Where harmony had once been natural, quiet rivalries appeared. Atlantis did not become corrupt, just less balanced. Solon pictured this shift like a calm sea slowly becoming restless. Not with waves, but with a slight, persistent stirring beneath the surface. The priest continued. The divine part of their nature began to fade, not fully, but enough for the human part to grow stronger. Many Atlanteans remained humble, peaceful, and devoted, but others developed subtle ambition. As their ships traveled farther and their trade expanded, some rulers believed Atlantis was destined to guide or even control other nations. They mistook their prosperity for permission to shape the world beyond their shores. The harmony that guided their earliest generations, the priest said, dimmed like a lamp with too little oil. The 10 kings, once united, started to disagree. Some pushed for expansion. Others wished to preserve the old ways. Their meetings in the sacred temple became less serene, filled with more discussion and less certainty. Among the people, too, small changes appeared. Merchants measured success by wealth rather than craft. Landowners sought larger estates. Sailors returned with tales of lands that could be ruled, not simply visited. Artisans competed for recognition. These were not signs of a fall, only signs of pride. Pride is gentle at first, the priest said softly. It enters like a warm breeze. Solon understood that the changes were gradual, nothing violent, nothing alarming, just a slow shift in attitude. The priest explained that even though rituals continued, they had lost some of their meaning. Offerings were made, but not always with sincerity. Laws were still read, but not always followed with the old devotion. The balance of the island began to waver, yet Atlantis still shone brightly. Ships filled its harbors. Fields remained fertile. Temples glowed in the morning light. The people still laughed, worked, and gathered at dusk. Above the beauty, however, the priest described a faint shadow, a sense that the island was drifting away from the harmony that had once defined it. He placed his hands gently on the stone table. Greatness without humility, he said, is like a ship without ballast. It may sail smoothly for a time, but even a light wind can shift its course. Solon felt the weight of the words, not fear, but the recognition that all civilizations, no matter how strong, face the quiet test of time and human nature. Atlantis had not fallen. Its greatness was still intact. Its people were still dignified. Its temples still stood firm. But the first subtle turning of fate had begun. scarcely noticed by those who lived through it. And from this delicate shift, the next chapter of the story would slowly emerge. The priest's voice grew softer as he reached the part of the story remembered with the deepest calm. His tone held no drama, no fear, only quiet respect. The final night of Atlantis, he said, was not a night of chaos. It was a night of change. Even in its last days, Atlantis still looked peaceful. Fields were full. Temples stood bright. Life moved in familiar patterns. Children played near the canals. Musicians performed simple melodies. Families gathered in their courtyards as the sun set behind the hills. But a deeper stillness settled over the island that evening. Not alarming, just unusual. The winds felt heavier. Animals grew quiet. The water in the circular canals moved slower than normal. People noticed, but without fear. They trusted their island, their gods, and the rhythms of life that had guided them for generations. As night fell, the moon rose over the city, casting silver light on the stone rings. Lamps glowed along the canals, and reflections shimmered across the water. From a distance, the whole island looked like a constellation floating on the sea. In the sacred temple, the 10 kings gathered. They stood before the shining metal pillar where the ancient laws were written. They offered calm prayers, not out of panic, but out of a wish to recover the harmony they sense slipping away. The priest did not speak of warnings or omens. He described only a gentle awareness, as if the island itself was preparing for something long foretold. Outside, most people slept peacefully. Fishermen rested beside their boats. Artisans slept after long hours of work. Families lay under blankets, listening to the soft night wind. Then, in the deepest part of the night, the earth began to tremble. It was not violent, not sudden, more like a long, deep sigh rising from beneath the island. Water in the canals rippled. Lamps flickered. The mountains in the distance shivered, shedding small stones from their slopes. Many people woke and stepped outside, but still there was no panic. The sea remained calm. The sky was clear. The moon shone brightly over the city. The trembling continued, slow, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The priest emphasized that this was not destruction, but nature seeking balance. When harmony fades, he said softly, the world quietly reminds us of its laws. Springs overflowed. Streets trembled. Walls groaned under the shifting ground. The circular harbors filled with widening rings of water. Some families embraced. Some whispered prayers. Others simply watched the sky, calm and accepting. The priest described it not as punishment, but as a return of the island to the sea that had nurtured it long before human memory. The earth reclaims what has drifted too far, he said gently, not in anger, but in balance. As the trembling deepened, the city began to sink. Water rose quietly between the rings. Gardens vanished beneath the waves. Stones settled as if guided by a soft, unseen hand. No screams, no panic, only the fading sound of water and the quiet breath of the night. Solon imagined the circular city illuminated by moonlight, slowly descending into the calm sea, as though falling into a deep, eternal sleep. The priest explained that the Egyptians preserved the story not to frighten, but to teach. Atlantis was a reminder that even the greatest civilizations must protect their harmony, or time will guide them gently back into the silence from which they came. When the priest finished, the chamber grew still. The lamps flickered softly. Solon felt not fear, but a quiet sadness, like watching the last light of dusk fade beneath the horizon. Atlantis, a place of beauty and balance, had slipped beneath the sea gently, naturally, and without anger, not lost, not forgotten, only returned to the deep, where its memory still rests beneath the quiet waves. The priest let a long silence rest between them before he spoke again. Not a heavy silence, rather the kind that follows the end of a long story, when emotions settle like dust in a still room. Solon waited, knowing instinctively that the final part of the tale was not about Atlantis itself, but about the memory it left behind. What remains, the priest said quietly, is not the island, but the lesson. He explained that after Atlantis slipped beneath the sea, nothing dramatic followed. No storm of legends spread through the world, no frantic search for survivors. For many lands, the island simply vanished, from trade routes, from daily life, from the minds of distant nations, but not from Egypt. The Egyptians, he said, kept records that stretched far into the past, farther than Greece, farther than most of the world. Their temples held inscriptions, scrolls, and memories preserved by generations of priests who saw themselves as guardians of knowledge. Atlantis was remembered not because of its wealth, but because of what its rise and fall revealed about human nature. The Atlanteans, he said, were not destroyed for their greatness. They drifted because they forgot the balance that greatness requires. He rested his hand lightly on the stone table, as though touching the past itself. Solon listened as the priest described how Egyptian scholars studied the story of Atlantis not as a warning of disaster, but as a quiet reminder that harmony must be preserved, that humility guards strength, that balance sustains nations, and that even the brightest civilizations are vulnerable to the soft pull of pride. None of these lessons were dramatic. They were simple, gentle truths, truths the Egyptians believed every generation should hear. That is why we tell the story, the priest said, not to frighten, but to guide. He explained that the memory of Atlantis survived through carefully copied records. Each generation of priests preserved the same descriptions Solon had heard: the circular city, the sacred temple, the council of 10 kings, the peaceful days of growth, and the final night when the island returned to the sea. The story was protected not because of the island's greatness, but because of its meaning. Atlantis shows us, the priest said softly, that a civilization is strongest when its heart is steady. Solon felt the truth of those words. He had heard tales of heroes and wars, of gods and monsters. But nothing in those stories felt as real or as calm as the tale of Atlantis, a place that rose gently, lived beautifully, drifted slowly, and returned quietly to the deep. What remains of Atlantis, the priest continued, is a memory carried across lands, from one people to another, a memory of harmony and of the gentle warning that harmony must be tended. He explained how Solon himself had become part of the story's journey. The tale came from the sea to our ancestors, and from our ancestors to us. Now we give it to you, so it may live again. Solon imagined the path of the story, from the last priests who witnessed the trembling earth, to the scribes who carved the first records, to the scholars who preserved them for centuries, to the Egyptian priest now speaking in a quiet temple, and finally to Solon, who would carry it back to Greece. The priest's voice became even softer. Stories survive when people honor them. And this one, he said, had survived because it carried a universal truth, one that belonged to every age, every people, every place touched by the sea. Atlantis was not remembered for its fall. It was remembered for its balance, its harmony, its understanding of nature, its respect for simple virtues that keep a civilization steady. The priest looked at Solon with a calm, knowing expression. "What remains of Atlantis," he repeated, "is the understanding that nothing beautiful is lost if its lesson endures." Outside the temple, the wind moved gently through the palm trees, a soft, steady sound, like waves brushing against a distant shore. Solon felt as though the breeze was carrying the memory of the island to him across time. The priest described how the sea still held the silence of Atlantis, not as a grave, but as a cradle of memory. Beneath the waves rested the stones of a once harmonious world, now part of the ocean's eternal rhythm. "Water remembers," the priest said, "and so do we." Solon closed his eyes for a moment, sensing the weight and gentleness of the story sinking into his thoughts like a stone settling at the bottom of a calm river. Atlantis, he realized, was not a tragedy. It was a reflection, a mirror showing the quiet truth that civilizations, like people, must tend to their hearts. As the priest finished the tale, the lamps flickered and the chamber grew still. The story of Atlantis had traveled through centuries to reach this moment, softly, steadily, without losing its meaning. And now it waited to travel further. The priest's voice became almost a whisper as he reached the end of the story, so soft that Solon had to lean forward to hear, though the words still carried clearly in the stillness of the temple. "The tale of Atlantis," he said, "is not only about the past. It is about the quiet places within us, where memory and wisdom rest side by side." He explained that long after the island slipped beneath the sea, the world continued as it always had. Seasons changed, new civilizations rose, old ones faded, generations passed like gentle waves rolling onto a shore. Yet the memory of Atlantis traveled across time, carried by those who understood its meaning. It was spoken in Egypt, written on scrolls, whispered in temples, and eventually told to Solon so it might find its way into new hands, new lands, new hearts. "Stories," the priest said, "are the vessels that carry truth through the ages." Solon felt that truth settling within him like a warm light. The story of Atlantis was not told to frighten or to warn of doom. It was shared to show the delicate balance between strength and humility, between prosperity and responsibility, between the rise of a people and the quiet shifts that guide their destiny. The priest lifted one of the small oil lamps on the stone table. Its flame flickered gently, casting soft shadows across the walls. "Great civilizations," he said, "are like this flame. They shine brightly. They warm the world around them. But they must be tended, with care, with respect, with humility. Otherwise the flame grows unsteady." He placed the lamp back down and folded his hands. But even when a flame goes out, the warmth it brought, the light it offered, these do not vanish. They remain in memory. Outside, the night breeze moves slowly through the temple courtyard. Solon imagined the quiet sea beyond Egypt's shores, stretching toward lands where Atlantis once stood. He pictured the moonlight shimmering on the waves, hiding yet honoring the ruins beneath. "What remains of Atlantis," he said softly, echoing the priest's earlier words, "is not the island, but the lesson." The priest nodded gently. "And you," he said, "are now its guardian, not of the land, but of the meaning. Carry it with care." Solon felt a deep sense of calm, a calm that came not from certainty, but from understanding. The story of Atlantis was more than an account of a distant island. It was a reminder that balance is fragile and precious, that the human spirit must always be watched gently, like a flame in shifting wind. As the priest rose, Solon stood with him. Together they walked to the entrance of the temple. The stars above the desert were clear and bright. The moon hung high, bathing the sand in silver light. A faint scent of warm earth and distant water drifted through the air. The priest spoke one last time. "The sea keeps many memories," he said, "and in its depths, Atlantis rests peacefully, not lost, not forgotten, simply returned to the silence from which it came." Solon stepped out into the open air. The vastness of the desert stretched before him, quiet and endless. He looked toward the west, imagining the great ocean far beyond the horizon. He felt no sadness, only serenity, as though the story had wrapped itself around him like a gentle cloak, guiding his thoughts into stillness. He walked slowly back through the temple gates, replaying the tale in his mind. The peaceful rise of Atlantis, the harmony of its people, the quiet turning of fate, the final night of calm descent, and the wisdom that endured long after the island disappeared beneath the waves. At the edge of the courtyard, Solon paused. The wind lifted slightly, carrying with it a softness that felt like the breath of the distant sea. Atlantis, he realized, had never truly vanished. It lived on in stories, in lessons, in the quiet truth that harmony is the root of all lasting greatness. And as long as someone remembered that truth, Atlantis would remain, not in stone, not in maps, but in understanding. The priest extinguished the remaining lamps behind him, and darkness settled gently over the temple. The night became peaceful, deep, and steady, like the ocean itself. Solon breathed in the cool air, closed his eyes, and let the calmness of the story carry him into silence. A silence as deep as the sea. A silence where Atlantis rests. A silence where wisdom endures